I've often labeled Call of Duty as a fragile esport, something that you can't really move around all that much. If you do, you can maybe even break it. Not many people realize how important this particular year is for franchising. Not only will there be new team names and new rosters, but the decision to allow for Call of Duty Esports to franchise has given it somewhat of an ultimatum. And I'll be honest, coming into this year, I'm very nervous. I think along with a lot of kind of Call of Duty Esports kind of people out there, a lot of people who've kind of been in the scene for a while, they're very nervous about this transition and about this upcoming season because of the decision to franchise it. And I got to say, the main reason why I'm nervous about all of this is just sheer the amount of change, right? The amount of losing these organizations and losing these organization names that have been in the esport for a decade plus. But how have we got to this point, right? How have we got to the point where we're so reliant on player names, so reliant in terms of organizations, etc.? How have we got to the point of which Call of Duty and the esports side has become somewhat fragile? Now, this is my honest feeling on the matter. This is the way that I personally look at how Call of Duty Esports has developed over the last few years, watching it as long as I have and kind of developing my personal sense on what I feel like it used to have in comparison to the way that it kind of progressively has gotten to. Now, let me be clear. It isn't one thing in particular. I think we can all kind of agree with that. For those who have watched Call of Duty Esports for a few different years, you've noticed maybe the transition of competitiveness, the way that it in some ways has gone down in terms of viewership, isn't related on one particular subject. But one particular thing for me has stuck out alongside, or rather outside of the rest. Something has revealed itself in my eyes as the main issue. And first, before I even bring that up, what makes Call of Duty fun to play in the first place, right? What is the major aspect that keeps people coming back to play this game? Most people, and myself included, would say the arcade style of it, right? The instant gratification of eliminating someone and the speed at which you do it, earning kill streaks or score streaks, taking down players with snipers, whatever it may be, the new weapons, etc., all of those things. And I don't feel as if that is the issue. Often the formula, the foundation just simply needs to be complemented on rather than to be replaced. When you get tired of the same look of a house, do you change the foundation? No, right? You change the details. You're not changing the core. You're simply just working on the inside. And one of those minor details, I believe personally, and my personal issue with the past few Call of Duty titles, is the maps. The maps are, I think, the underlying issue behind why the Call of Duty yearly cycle has continued to cause some negatives. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that the Call of Duty yearly cycle is honestly great in certain aspects. It adds excitement. It gives us something to look forward to, and it is unique. Not many, if any, other titles can pull something off like we have, right? Since Call of Duty 4, Modern Warfare will be the 13th title that we have played competitively. Who else can say that? Who else can say that they have played 13 different competitive games all underneath the same branch in terms of Call of Duty? It's unique. It's different. No one else can have that same type of replication. Now, many people assume when I bring up the conversation of maps and the issue with it is that it has to do with the sheer amount of maps that are allowed in the competitive rotation. I've even heard pros talk about how we need more map variety. The problem is that we don't want to see the same maps played over and over and over again. And I'll be honest, I don't think that's the issue. I really don't. I don't believe that is the problem. I believe that it's honestly the quality of the maps that are the real issue. It's not about the amount. It's about the quality of which we're playing with outside of just the sheer amount of them. Now let's go to one of the best competitive Call of Duty titles of all time to back up my claim on this one, right? Black Ops 2, regarded as, by a lot of people, their favorite competitive Call of Duty ever. Not necessarily their favorite, but their favorite competitive Call of Duty title of all time. How many different maps were used back then? Does anybody know? 6. 6 different maps were used back in Black Ops 2. How many different maps, though, were used this year in Black Ops 4? It's the same. It's 6. So that already goes to show to me that just because we have a certain amount of maps doesn't necessarily mean that that is the overwhelming issue, is just the sheer amount of we need more. It is the matter for me of we need better of what we currently have. Now that doesn't end here. Let's choose 2 titles that usually aren't fan favorites by a lot of people, right? These are ones that were recently done in competitive, so they've kind of been in that conversation as well. Let's bring up World War II and Infinite Warfare. By no means one of my favorites in terms of competitive history, but I'll say it regardless. How many different maps did they use for competitive? How many different maps were used in either of those titles? For each of them, it was 7. They used more overall maps than we saw in Black Ops 2 and more than we saw this year in Black Ops 4. And for many, they would argue that these 2 competitive years were better than those. For me, the biggest issue that Call of Duty Esports has had to deal with throughout this yearly cycle is the quality and the competitiveness of maps. I don't even want to discuss the recent developer that talked on how the fun was taken out due to competitive. That, for me, is just maybe a subject of conversation for another day. But when we look at the idea of maps itself, we have to look at other games as well, right? How would basketball work without the lines drawn on the floor, without the hoop in place exactly where it is? What good would the objective of baseball do if the bases weren't exactly placed where they were? What would really be the objective in those sports if things were all changed up? The environment itself for the game you play ultimately decides every single moment. Every single little situation is done by hardpoint hills. It's done by bomb sites, by capture the flag points and control zones when it comes to Black Ops 4. And quickly on the topic of game modes, believe it or not, take the 5 game mode conversation seriously. There's been some rumors talking about how when it comes down to Modern Warfare, this next title, we could in fact see 5 different game modes. The CDL wants to take as many things from the Overwatch League as they can. And the OWL, they play 4 different game modes, and it wouldn't shock me, despite Call of Duty's vast history, right, decades long as we've already talked about, if they would try to do something very similar. And if so, that puts more pressure on what? The maps to be better than they ever have, to be more versatile than they ever have as well, to work for different game modes while also trying to complement each other. And to go off on another esport very, very briefly before we round things down, the reason why I believe CSGO is looked upon as one of the best competitive games in esports, that one of the best, if not the best competitive FPS in all of history, is because of the maps. Dust 2 is literally older than I am. And it's played competitively for over 20 years, and people still love it. They love the idea of it. These maps have existed for so long, and the reason why the competitiveness is there, the reason why the pros are so well respected, and the reason why it's been around for as long as it has and thriving the best that it has ever is because of the sheer competitiveness, which for me results around the maps. It results on how those situations are inbound. This year will be the most important year in Call of Duty Esports history. Don't get it wrong. This year, if it does not go well, or within the next few does not go well, it could cause major problems with the scene as we know it. So while I feel the Call of Duty yearly cycle is important, I think at the same time, it provides a cover-up for the overwhelming issue of not having enough competitive game modes, or rather not having enough competitive maps to play those game modes on that we have each and every single season. It's not about the sheer amount, it's about the quality itself based on what we've talked about, right? Black Ops 2 did not have as many as Infinite Warfare, yet Black Ops 2 is considered to be the best competitive game mode by a lot of different people. What was the biggest issue this year in Black Ops 4 Search and Destroy this season? The way you sprint at people, the aggressiveness, the way that the maps were played allowed for a total different aggressive style. A lot of people called it TDM, but just with one life. And that, for me, could have been avoided. The chaos could have been avoided if the maps were done differently. And don't get me wrong, throughout this entire thing, I'm by no means a map designer. By no means have I worked on any of those things, but I believe that Call of Duty's yearly cycle will ultimately be tested this year specifically and for years to come, because we've never seen a franchised esport come out with a new title every year. And already, we've seen major negatives come from this very aspect. One of those things that I think gets swept underneath the carpet, that gets swept right underneath the rug, is the importance of maps.